It's been a long discussion on cognitive penetration. I think we've gone pretty deep for a first year course at least. But now it's time to draw some conclusions. So grab a cup of tea, let's get to it. The question, of course, is whether cognition penetrates perception. And what we've seen is that there's a reasonable case against that view. And the reasonable case against that view hinges on phenomena like the tunnel effect. Your perception tells you something which is incorrect, and you have beliefs which could correct that perception, but appear to have no effect on it at all. Now, the important thing here, I picked out the tunnel effect because I'm particularly fond of that tunnel effect, and it allowed me to have a kind of single theme running through much of the discussion here. It illustrates something very important about perception, the idea that perception is partly a process of filling in missing details. But the evidence against cognitive penetration is by no means confined to the tunnel effect. Almost any case in which you can systematically generate perceptual errors, those perceptual errors will be entirely impervious to what someone believes or knows. And so that would also be an illustration of cognition failing to penetrate perception. But we've also seen that there are three key pieces of evidence, at least, for cognitive penetration. We know from Bruner and Goodman that some people think that your beliefs about value of objects can change how large or small you perceive those objects to be. We know from Conan et al., part of Chris Witzel's work, that your beliefs about the kind of things, whether it's a banana or not, can affect the perception of colour. And we seem to know that Levin and Banerjee claim that your beliefs about someone's race can influence your perception of lightness or darkness. So just here we face what appears to be a kind of contradiction. We have a reasonable case for the claim that cognition penetrates perception, and a reasonable claim against that case. What should we do here? Is there a way to respond to this? Now, I'm going to suggest an answer to that question in a minute, and I don't think it's something that you can necessarily get just by thinking, but I do think it's worth having a chat to somebody who might have a different view from yours, so that you might learn to appreciate something about the other side. So I just want you to spend, ideally with your lecture buddies, the next 90 seconds on the question, does cognition penetrate perception? In the light of the evidence that we have seen, what do you think is the most plausible answer and why? 90 seconds, go. So if we were having a live lecture, I'd be curious to know what you're thinking. As it happens, we're not. So let me tell you what I'm thinking and see if you agree or not. You may find that this is merely a provocation, and that's of course fine as long as you have an argument. The key thing to remember here is that your opinions are not significant. Okay, I've got my opinion, you've got yours. What we've really got to focus on here is what evidence is available and what does that evidence show. That's what we're focusing on here. So the disagreement that we want is within that. Now, what I want to suggest to you is something very simple. I would suggest that if we look at the various bits of evidence for the claim that cognition penetrates perception, in each case we encounter some problems. So take the Bruner and Goodman study, which I showed you in an earlier section, the one involving coins and paper discs, and the idea was that 10-year-olds, and presumably they think adults too, but certainly 10-year-olds, perceive objects of higher monetary value as being larger than they truly are. An early attempt to replicate this study by Carter and Schuler found no such effect whatsoever. This was a rather careful replication, and if you look at this chart carefully, what you can see is that they've plotted Bruner and Goodman's original findings, so that's the line up there for the coins, and their own findings are somewhere down here, right, almost close to zero. So what these researchers find, Carter and Schuler, is that people do, if you ask them to make judgments on the basis of memory, tend to imagine that coins are larger than they really are. There is something to Bruner and Goodman's research, but it's not really perception. When you show them the coin, as Bruner and Goodman did in their crucial conditions, when you show people the coin, they don't systematically overestimate or underestimate the size of those coins. Now, one failure to replicate by itself is not particularly interesting to us because, after all, you got a successful experiment and then an experiment which didn't reveal the same result. What should you do? But the interesting thing is this is going back to 1949, and since then, as far as I'm aware, there isn't a single successful replication. So Bruner and Goodman's experiments kicked off a whole range of research of theory of perception called the New Look. In fact, very influential, but there have been, to my knowledge, 0 successful replications. So it really seems that that research does not provide evidence for the view that cognition penetrates perception. Why did I mention that at all then? Well, partly I wanted you to understand the methods, and I think that the Bruner and Goodman idea allows you to see quite nicely a good method for finding evidence in favour of the claim that cognition penetrates perception. The methods are great, it's just that the results, as you can see here, do not point in that direction. In fact, they point to the idea that cognition does not penetrate perception. So that was one reason. Another reason is that there's also a kind of relatively straightforward refutation. If you think again about the results that Bruner and Goodman reported, you're seeing that people overestimate the diameter of a coin by something like 10 to 20%, perhaps even more. So that's a kind of an illusion that you and I ought to be aware of in much of our everyday life. The magnitude of the error is way above the threshold of perceptual discrimination. So we really ought to be imagining, for example, that this huge coin is not going to fit in my pocket as I try to put the coin in my pocket. We're going to have that kind of problem, but we don't see that kind of problem in everyday life. The third reason is that the Bruner and Goodman study is still carelessly cited by many authors. To take just one example, O'Callaghan and colleagues suggest that social status is found to affect perceptions of the size of coins, quoting just the Bruner and Goodman study, and they offer no qualification about the failures to replicate that study. Now, if you think about it, this is just mad. This is like a physicist writing, cold fusion is a thing that you can reproduce in the lab, and citing the original study. Now, that study on cold fusion famously was never replicated. Looks like there was an error that those scientists made. Same thing with Bruner and Goodman. It's not a finding that we can put any weight on whatsoever. And yet, if you're not careful, you're still going to find people who report just this finding. Don't make the same mistake as them. If you're reporting a piece of research, always be careful to talk about attempts to replicate that and whether they were successful or not. In this case, Bruner and Goodman's research about value beliefs influencing perceived size doesn't replicate. You cannot rely on their evidence. It's a brilliant experiment, it's a lovely idea, but it does not provide evidence for cognitive penetration. Now, things are more interesting with the other bits of evidence. Things are not nearly so straightforward. The second piece of evidence, if you remember, was this idea that your belief about the kind of an object, for example, whether or not it's a banana, can influence the perceived colour of the object. Now, that finding has been replicated several times and has so far stood up quite well. So what could be the problem with it? Well, take a look at these three objects right here. So here you see a disc, a banana and a disc. And maybe you could move just close to the screen and take a second and ask yourself, thinking just about the colour of the surfaces, which is the odd one out here? Thinking just about the colour of the surfaces, which is the odd one out here? Is it this disc? Is it the banana in the middle? Or is it the disc on the other side, further away from me where I can't reach it? Which is the odd one out? This is the question that Valenti and Firestone asked their subjects. And of course, this display is constructed, if you look really carefully, I hope you can see this. This display is constructed so that the disc here is genuinely grey. It really matches the background with respect to colour. Whereas the banana and the other disc, they have a blue tinge. So if you were thinking just about the colour, you would say that this is the odd one out. Maybe you said that, maybe you don't, I'm not sure. Whereas, if the argument about memory colour is correct, that the blue tinged banana is perceived as being exactly grey because the belief about the banana's yellowness actually adds to the perceived yellowness of the banana, and therefore you have to undo that by going in the opposite direction, away from the grey and into the blue in order to make it properly grey. If that were right, then you ought to see that the far out disc that I can't reach here, the disc furthest away from me, is the odd one out. That's what you ought to say, because that's the only one that ought to look blue. So Valenti and Firestone, brilliant idea. And their thought was this: if the banana effect is genuinely a perceptual effect, then it ought to result in odd one out judgments that correspond to the perceived colour. But as you can guess from the fact that I'm telling you about this experiment, what they found actually was that the vast majority of subjects picked out the object which was actually grey, the disc here, the actually grey disc, as the odd one out and not the blue one. Now we're in an interesting position. There is a prediction that the view that cognition penetrates perception makes, that you should pick out the blue disc furthest away from me as the odd one out. And that prediction is falsified by this evidence. We should be cautious here. One piece of evidence which appears to falsify a theory wouldn't by itself cause us to throw that theory away. On the other hand, we're now in this awkward position where we've got some evidence in favour of the theory, but apparently equally strong evidence against the theory. And if you look carefully at what Valenti and Firestone have written, a comparably interesting theory about the original findings. So just here, I think we can say we don't really have evidence either way. We don't really have evidence either way. It's not that we can't replicate the original findings. We can, but the interpretation of those findings as a genuine perceptual effect is brought into doubt by the failure of the odd one out paradigm. For me personally, I'm on the edge of my seat waiting to see what future evidence might be published on this. This is the most recent thing I know about, but I'm fairly sure that those involved will be able to come up with further ingenious paradigms to take our knowledge further. Okay, so where am I with this? As far as the idea that the belief about the kind of an object, that it's a banana, can alter your perception of colour goes, I think what we have to say is we don't have strong evidence either way yet on that point. Now, what about the study by Levin and Banerjee, which was in some ways similar to the banana study? This suggests that your belief about somebody's race can influence perception of lightness or darkness. In response to that study, Firestone and Scholl were suspicious that although the stimuli that Levin and Banerjee had used were carefully matched for lightness overall, it could be that nevertheless, because of the patterns, the different patterns inevitably in the stimuli, they were perceived as having different lightnesses, irrespective of the race categorization. So to test this theory that they had, this conjecture, what they did was to take the same stimuli that Levin and Banerjee used, but to apply a kind of blurring filter to them in order to conceal the information that subjects were using to categorize them by race. So most of the subjects in the Firestone and Scholl experiment were unable to identify the racial category of the two blurred faces, and they often believed them to be the same when in fact they were from allegedly different categories in the original experiment. So blurring was successful. For most participants, it eliminated the cues that they were using to make judgments about racial category. But importantly, what Firestone and Scholl found was that subjects nevertheless continued to judge the faces that had been previously categorized as black by the other participants as darker than the faces that had been previously categorized as white by the other participants. In other words, they took away cues to racial identity, racial category, I should say, and nevertheless still found the Levin and Banerjee effect. That led them to conclude that in Levin and Banerjee's study, the difference in perceived lightness was not a consequence of the racial categorization, but just a consequence of some low-level feature of the stimuli, the distribution of light and dark across the images. Does that make sense to you? The idea is this. Somebody says racial category is affecting perceived lightness. Firestone and Scholl's response is remove that racial category via the blurring mechanism. You still get the effects on perceived lightness or darkness. Therefore, beliefs about racial category are not making a difference to the perception of lightness or darkness after all. They're not driving the perception of lightness or darkness. So again, this is not a failure to replicate Levin and Banerjee's findings. Those findings stand up absolutely fine. It's just that their interpretation of the findings is now doubtful. Now, Levin and Banerjee and some of their group respond to this argument against their work in a paper by Baker and colleagues that I've mentioned just under this section in the readings. And you can see that they do not take this to be a good refutation of their work. And the debate continues in the further work by Firestone and Scholl. So I think we need to be very, very careful here. I can't tell you that I think Firestone and Scholl's refutation is entirely convincing. I can't tell you that I think Levin, Banerjee and Baker provide an entirely convincing response to the attempt to refute their conclusions. I think that in this case, we do genuinely need further work in order to understand which effects are genuinely perceptual effects. But at the very least, it would be a mistake for somebody to regard Levin and Banerjee's study, as things stand, as providing sufficient evidence to conclude that there is cognitive penetration of perception. The results just don't provide for that conclusion as things stand, because it may well be that their stimuli are poorly chosen and that the effects they're describing are a consequence partly of people's beliefs rather than their perceptions in some of their experiments, and partly of the poor choice of stimuli. Here we'd be happy if there were a variety of labs that took up the challenge here and used different facial stimuli, a whole range of different facial stimuli, and were able to find the same results with respect to racial categorization affecting perceived likeness, but were unable to find the same things when they blurred the stimuli very carefully, then we'd be happy. And conceivably that could happen. Or conceivably, Levin and Banerjee's findings will not stand up to that kind of careful scrutiny, in which case it'll be time to move on. So where are we? Where are we here? I've suggested that we face a difficult problem because we have evidence for the thesis that cognition penetrates perception and evidence against the thesis that cognition penetrates perception. But if we take a closer look at the evidence for the claim that cognition penetrates perception, we find that either it doesn't replicate, or else further predictions associated with the research are not borne out in a way that they should be, are falsified, or else the interpretation of the original finding doesn't actually seem to show, the correct interpretation of the original finding doesn't seem obviously one on which it's the belief or cognition in question that's driving the effect, so may not provide evidence of cognitive penetration. And these are the best, strongest, most direct pieces of evidence for cognitive penetration of perception that I could find. So my conclusion is simple. Oh, sorry, I should have said one more thing actually before I revealed the answer that I'm aiming at. If we look at the evidence on the other side, this is evidence that's readily available, makes perfect sense on the basis of your ordinary experience. It's not some sort of obscure psychological argument that you need for this evidence. And there's lots and lots and lots and lots of it. Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots. So, on the other side, the evidence against cognitive penetration is comparably robust. People have been trying for nearly a century to show that cognition penetrates perception. This is where they've got to. It's not very impressive. So our conclusion, tentatively, should be cognition probably does not penetrate perception. We may in the future be surprised by some new and exciting evidence, but a careful survey of the existing evidence does not yet provide for the evidence. On the contrary, evidence against the claim that cognition penetrates perception is strong and robust.